As investigations continue into the New Year's Day terrorist attack in New Orleans and the Cybertruck explosion in Las Vegas, the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security have sent out a joint bulletin advising law enforcement nationwide to be hypervigilant and prepared for potential copycat attacks. The bulletin also notes that ISIS has been promoting the use of vehicles as terrorism weapons over the past decade, but that the terrorist group has been ramping up their calls for attacks amid the Israel and Hamas war. But is it more warnings and vigilance that we need? Can we really simply ramp up enough security to fend off these types of attacks? Joining me now to discuss this is former Secret Service Special Agent Tim Miller, founder and president of Lionheart International Services Group. He's a 30-year law enforcement and military professional whose extensive background includes leadership roles in Homeland Security, law enforcement, and United States Marine Corps. Tim, welcome back to Washington Watch. Semper Fi.
Semper Fi, Tony. It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
First, before we jump into some of the particulars I want to talk about, can you share with us the latest that's come out over the last 24 hours on these two incidents?
Yeah, Tony, the concern that you have in any major incident is that, there's a free flow of information initially, but then more substantive information begins to come out. And not everybody's so focused on it anymore. And in the case of the New Orleans attack, it couldn't be a worst case scenario because it was a double whammy. It was a U.S. military member causing traumatic loss of life. And when you look at the radicalization process, and that's what's been coming out within the last 24 hours, it is very evident that he was radicalized. Everything about his value system changed. Even post, saying that he was going to kill his own family and decided not to because he didn't want to take away from the greater cause. So I think, it's shocking. The thing you touched on, Tony, I think it's so critical. In the Secret Service, when we had an attack, we had to assume that there were lots of other folks out there just waiting to do the same thing. And because of that, I think we need to be as vigilant as we can. In L.A., the attack in Las Vegas, more information is coming out that is truly shocking. Perhaps it wasn't what was represented, a disgruntled person. There's information coming out that indicates he was a very reliable member of the 10th Special Forces Group, which that unit. And so there's a lot of information flowing, all of which suggests, Tony, that I think we have a rough road ahead in 2025.
Yeah, the Las Vegas leaves me more puzzled than New Orleans. The radicalization of the attacker in New Orleans makes sense. I'm waiting for more information this guy was 5 Bronze Stars in Las Vegas.
Yeah.
Currently on active duty.
And to that point, Tony, there is more information. There's a lot more information. The initial story doesn't add up. All of us have said that. And as early or as late as a few hours ago, I saw some information that suggested he had tried to notify a lot of folks about some things going on. And I think you're going to see breaking news soon that maybe it wasn't what was portrayed, by the media. And to that end, it's a tragedy because that man lost his life. We all know, Tony, you and I know, if he'd applied his professional capabilities to do mass damage, he could have done a horribly more impacting attack. And that didn't happen. The question which you raise, why?
Yeah, because, just basic improvised devices that he could have put together. What was in the back of that vehicle was, no one that has any kind of professional skills would have put that together. It's very rudimentary.
Yeah.
But I want to go a little deeper on this, Tim, because, by the way, the headlines this afternoon in the AP, New Orleans attack and Vegas explosion highlight extremist violence by active military and veterans. And so here we go. We're going to start pinpointing veterans and military personnel as a threat to our nation. We've seen this before. I mean, obviously, those are individuals who are trained, and as you said, this man in Las Vegas could have done a lot more had he really wanted to because of his training. But I want to go to the issue of the radicalization and how this is happening. I mean, it's one thing to have an external threat. And I know people saying, well, we got to close down the border. And I'd agree, we got to close the border. But this wouldn't, the border closure wouldn't have affected these two cases. These are Americans. And these are individuals who, native to this country, radicalized somehow. The only thing I'm left with, Tim, and I don't have as an extensive background as you do, but I did work in anti-terrorism. I worked as a police officer. I was in the Marine Corps. There are some things you just can't protect against. We have to rely upon divine protection at some point as a nation. And we've created this spiritual vacuum that's being filled by a hateful ideology. My take.
No, I think you're spot on, Tony. And it does beg the question, what changed from when we were in to now? And I think there are some very important things that we're not calling out because of political correctness. You know, we've allowed every kind of ideology to be celebrated, and, you know, even in the U.S. military, drag shows, and there is an absolute moral vacuum that used to not be, because everybody that came into the military understood we were all united under the banner of the red, white, and blue. And when you compromise those values, you constantly tell people, well, I know your conscience says this, but you must believe this. It does create a free fall, which I think we're seeing. I talk to a lot of military members who are incredibly frustrated because the values that they believe in, Christian values, are being scorned, mocked, and sometimes suppressed. And so I'm hopeful under this new administration that we can let the U.S. military get back to being what the U.S. military is, because it is a call up. Tony, you and I entered the military because it was something bigger than ourselves.
Right.
And as believers, you were serving the nation.
Right.
We got to get back to that.
And here is part of my concern, Tim. We all want security. I mean, that was a big issue in this election. The crime and people want security. They want their families to be secure. I do. But not at the cost of my freedom. And what if we're going to have a government that's big enough to protect us, absent a moral foundation that we govern ourselves by, it's a government that's big enough to take all the freedoms that we cherish.
Amen, Tony. And I'll tell you, brother, I really believe that it starts with holding the government accountable, with remembering they're the primary enforcers of our rights. You know, we, the people, have established rights that they have to enforce. And when you see things being done, unfortunately, by government entities, like opening the borders, letting jails be emptied of violent criminals in other countries who are here now, you know, it puts us in an awkward position. But, you know, everybody we train organizations all over the world. Everybody I talk to, I encourage that you now are your own security director. You have to be in a position where you learn the skills, have the mindset to protect yourself. That doesn't mean we're crazy, you know, weapons wielding people, but it does mean we understand we must protect ourselves. But back to your point, Tony, it all starts with a very solid document called the Constitution, right, where we were guaranteed rights, and we have to hold the government accountable. We need to stand. If there ever is a time, that's why I love being on with you. You are standing strong. Every believer in this nation needs to stand strong for Christ, because I'll tell you, we're at risk of losing this great nation if we don't begin to put things back in place, like values and morals and Christian ethics that made us great to begin with.
Well, and that's right. The path to greatness begins with moral goodness. And as you make reference to the Constitution, which is what it's the agreement by which we as citizens agree to be governed. But John Adams, second president of the United States, he said, our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. And so there was a presupposition that there was going to be a foundation of morality, but we've had the government in the last, I would say going all the way back to the 1960s, pushing consistently that morality connected to Christianity out of the public space. It's left this huge vacuum. People then become radicalized by these other ideologies because evil hates a vacuum, a void. It's going to fill it. And here we are. And this is what we have today.
That is so true, Tony. And I'll tell you, I can remember faces and names of Christians in the U.S. Marine Corps that showed what it looked like to walk with God, that weren't shy in sharing their faith, that stood on the moral high ground, that reached down and helped Marines that were struggling. Now, if you do that, you can get court-martialed. So to your point, we got to get back to being men and women of courage, of faith, and because if not, we've seen what happens, Tony, when we kick God out of the schools.
Right.
Schools now are the most violent places that you can be. Why? Because we kick God out, and now we're shocked that Satan walked right on in the door.
And this is not about government imposing religion. It's allowing people, it's allowing believers to live out their faith, as you just described a moment ago, that when that faith is on display, it's attractive. People that are having challenges want to know, hey, how can I have that peace? You seem to have it all together. Can you tell me the secret behind that? And when we're able to be open about our faith, and we are courageous about sharing our faith, which not every Christian is, but we should be, that has a contagious effect.
Tony, it so does. And really, it's not our idea, it's God's idea. We actually live out as a living testimony to the Lord. We say, no, you can make those choices, but we believe God has more for you. But even that spirit now, if you think about it, it's been identified as extreme right. It's been identified as radical. Oh, but by the way, we don't care that ISIS is blowing up folks in our cities. That's not considered radical because that doesn't fit. You and I know it's extreme radicalism, but the bottom line is that that level of evil is allowed to prosper because we no longer value the righteousness that we once valued, and that can only be found in the living God.
Tim, we just have about 2 minutes left. I want to go back to something you said kind of at the beginning of our conversation, and that is we need to basically put on the seatbelt, buckle the helmet for 2025 and what's ahead. These challenges, it's going to get a little more turbulent before it gets better, right?
Well, I certainly think it is, Tony, but we can't ignore that, policies have consequences. Elected leaders making bad calls cost people a lot. And in this case, I believe it's going to cost people their blood because we've let so many evil people in. There was a season in our country, we only let people in that wanted to be Americans. They wanted to have our values. But we've let folks in, Tony, that are incredibly evil. We're seeing crime on the streets. We're seeing gang takeovers in certain U.S. cities. Now we're seeing the rise of terrorism. Quite frankly, Tony, I don't think we've even seen the beginning of the terrorists. There are so many folks angry at the U.S. for a number of reasons, but now they used to be in Tehran screaming death to America. Now, the day after the New Orleans attack, they're screaming it in Manhattan. Yeah. And you have to ask yourself the question, we've invited evil right into the front door, and we need to be prepared for that.
We've left the door wide open. And they have come in, and we wonder how they have invaded our home. Tim, I want to thank you for joining us. Always great to talk with you. Thanks so much for giving us your insights today. And again, Happy New Year to you.
Thank you, brother, for having me. I'm praying for you and for all that you're doing.